Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to finish up Rosemary Salomone's The Rise of English. So if you're tuning into this, what are you doing? Go and see part one. And you'll learn all about the way in which English is rising. It's greatly affecting colleges and universities all across the world. And I think it's a big problem. I think it's a big problem. I think that it's a sign of one of the many deleterious effects of just global capitalism, in that colleges, so many other institutions are pandering to the demands of the market that happen to privilege English speakers because, no coincidence, through centuries of English colonialism, it has now developed into the case that speaking English in many different contexts is more valuable than any knowledge you can acquire at school. Like any kind of specialized knowledge or whatever. And this is one of the things they like to lie to you about. The conspirators, because the people the conspirators, who like to lie to you about, is to tell you and to tell us that in order for us to actually earn a spot in the world, as far as jobs go, as far as opportunity goes, you have to learn all of these skills and do all this stuff, pay thousands and thousands of dollars to go to college and learn all this stuff. But really, most of the time, when you get to your job, they're going to train you how to do the job anyways. And one of the things that you can learn that's just going to give you a leg up above everybody else is English. And that is it seems so unfair to me. And I've covered so many texts in the past that take on this issue either directly or indirectly. I mean, I just did Gugiwa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. I just did Oyewumi's The Invention of Women, in which talking about the imposition of English is a colonial tool, and it historically has been. Some other texts to consider is texts on tourism. So some of the ones would be In Between by Ortega, or anything I've done with bell hooks and the idea of eating the other, in which English is kind of offered up as this universal language where English speakers never really feel like they need to take on the language of anybody else, because they recognize themselves as being the cosmopolitan global face and language. And therefore, they can just never learn another language, learn other cultures or anything. They're just see themselves as the center of the universe. And of all of the kind of isms, all the kind of oppressions that many people recognize, I really feel that identifying Anglocentrism as a kind of oppression is something that often doesn't get enough attention. And I think it has to be addressed. I think that the big project here is addressing capitalism, which is one of the things that about Salomone that really bothers me, is that she's just kind of presenting this stuff as though, it's one of the conditions of the global market today. And yeah, there are problems with it. We're going to have to adapt, yada, yada, yada. But it's this is a symptom of just capitalism. It's just what it is. And the colonial legacies that would eventually culminate into what we now know to be full-fledged capitalism. And I think that, and a long intro, and I think this is going to be really clear now, because we're going to consider, at least Salomone considers, the effects of English and the kind of battle between European languages within African nations. So we're going to look at a few of them. We're going to look at India as well, which isn't in Africa, but we're going to look at other nations and how they are navigating and reckoning with legacies of colonialism and how that is translating into current policy with regards to their approach to English. So let's start with chapter 6 here, titled The Shadows of Colonialism, or The New Scramble for Africa, I should say. So through centuries of European colonialism, many African nations primarily speak European languages. These are some of their most spoken languages across Africa. French and English probably being the most common, I would say. Of course, there's the colonial history of Arabic, especially in Northern Africa. Trust me, I'm not erasing the fact that there are many, and we're going to talk about this, many indigenous African languages that are still widely spoken. We're going to talk about that a lot. But really, it's so common. You can go to many different places in Africa, and they're going to be speaking a European language, be it French or English or anything like that. Now, Salomone felt the need now to consider, because of course you can't just criticize Europe on its own, felt the need to mention the fact that currently China is engaged in its own kind of quote-unquote neocolonialism within Africa. And this is a thing. China, especially through its Belt and Road Initiative. And for those of you that don't know, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's investment in infrastructure, in roads, and other things all across like Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, through African nations. And people, especially in the West, love to criticize China for this, for it being an example of debt trapping. And I'm not saying this isn't the case, but I think it's really the most extreme case of the pot calling the kettle black when you have those, geopolitics people in Canada and the US and France and whatever, pointing the finger at China for being pernicious with the way in which they're giving financial aid to African nations. It's like, really? You're going to criticize China? Really? But in any case, China is engaged in these investments within many African nations, Kenya being one of them, many Eastern African nations, in which they're investing in a lot of stuff there, and it's doing a lot of great stuff for the people there. Is it secretly an effort by China to debt trap these countries? Perhaps. I mean, I have no idea. I'm not in Xi Jinping's mind. I don't know what their plans are. But in any case, Salomone mentions that currently you can actually go into many parts of Africa and people are going to be speaking Mandarin. And this is just one of the things, at the core here, regardless of China's intent, we are seeing this repetition of these legacies of colonialism against African nations that have just been happening over and over and over again, that it seems like no one's being held accountable for. Now, in the case of France, France is engaged in its own kind of diplomatic capture and trapping all throughout many African nations. It has been for centuries, but of course they aren't. You can't criticize them. You can only criticize China. But one of the things that emerged within France, especially as it was losing its grip, as we talked about last time, as being the cosmopolitan language of enlightenment, where France, you'd think of some important figures. There's Talleyrand, there's others who were monumental for the construction of the Declaration of Human Rights and all that stuff. France was once the language of enlightenment in a lot of cases. And shared it with English and Italian, whatever. But it really held that place. And as it started to lose its grip on that title, it started to feel the need to start to rope in all the French-speaking people on Earth and to put them under this communal umbrella of a recognition of a communal heritage. And so was born the idea of la francophonie, which is, I should have looked this up. Would there be a translation? The francophonie. It's referring to French-speaking people all around the globe. And it refers to everyone within and outside of France that speak French. However, the French avoided the term for most of the century. So I think that de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, he led France. He was in leader of France in the 60s. He never used the term. Because, at the time, within the mid-20th century, France was kind of reckoning with the fact that it had a pretty turbulent history with colonialism, and that it was kind of recognizing that maybe the fact that people all around the world spoke French was kind of a bad sign for the French. Something the British never felt any guilt about, so at least it seemed like the French had a little bit of guilt about this. But la francophonie wasn't a term that de Gaulle or anyone at the time was really using in any kind of public way in France. The term would gain some more traction in the 90s, eventually establishing what is called the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie in 2005. And it is now made up of approximately 90 countries. Canada, Algeria is not on that list, because Algeria effectively emancipated itself from France in its own decolonial efforts. There are so many other ones that fall under this, that belong to this organization. But this organization is essentially responsible. What it does is it gives funds, like publishing funds and other creative funds for producing French language content all across the world in all these different places. Now, one of the pernicious elements of this organization of La Francophonie is that it makes sure that France has a kind of presence in every part of the world that speaks French. Because France, I think. It's really starting to realize that French is not a France language. It's not France's language. In fact, French is mostly spoken within Africa. It's really an African language at this point, which if that bothers you to hear something like that, you should probably think about what, your relationship to a language is. Is it that you think it should be pure, should be reserved for the white Europeans? If that's the case, that might be a problem. But French is really an African language now. Now, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie has some other really negative elements to it, because it has largely retained the idea that French is the language of enlightenment, of like freedom, of liberty, all the colors of the French flag, fraternité, égalité, liberté, like equality, fraternity, and liberty are the kind of ideas. And sometimes the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie can veer pretty close to Islamophobia. Not saying that that's the case, but it can sometimes come kind of close to that, in that it views, and France in general has not had a good approach to Islam in any case. There's a lot of anti-Islamic rhetoric within France at high political levels, and it's a problem. It's a problem, and it's only exacerbated by organizations like this that try to uphold these things, equality and freedom and liberty, at least it claims to, and it views Islam as being opposed to these things. Of course, this is all just Western propaganda, but in any case, it views Islam in these ways, and so it at times can adopt a fairly anti-Islamophobic approach. But does this mean that France has gotten over, has reconciled, has made amends for its colonial past? No, no. In one of Macron's speeches, Macron, the French president, he told one of his speeches, 10 years ago? Was it 2012 or something? Maybe 12 years ago, give or take. He told listeners that Europe's colonial past is unquestionable, but that, in his words, it is a past that needs to pass. And that French has a future, and this future is playing out in Africa. Which is like, really? How do you not perceive that as just the triumph of colonialism, where you're celebrating the fact that your colonial language is playing out in the place that you colonized? Congrats. While saying that the idea about European colonialism, we need to do away with it, like, okay, bravo. And in cases like this, one of the other elements of this is that he's treating African nations as just a battleground for European interests, as being a battleground for Europe versus the East, with the struggle between the clash of civilizations. Almost, it's this repeated harkening back to these age-old conflicts that aren't at play in these ways, but when he says stuff like this, it appeals to people's deep-seated cultural ideas about conflict, about this clash of civilizations, and it speaks to them in these ways. Now, in the face of this, some French-speaking people, some people not from France, in Africa, called for a decoupling of French from its implicit association with France, which, of course, the French in France aren't going to tolerate. Of course not. But there's a good reason for it. So, for example, of the 110,000 French books published each year, this is about 4 years ago, not even, this book came out a couple of years ago, of the 110,000 French books published each year, 90,000 come from Europe, 15,000 come from Canada, so Quebec mostly, and about 5,000 from the rest of the world. So still, we see, in the case of publishing, that France holds a monopoly on most of the content that is being produced in French. Now, if France truly cared about French, it would facilitate things like immigration from French-speaking nations into France. But of course, it doesn't want to do that. I mean, there's a huge problem in France with racism, where there's so much racism against North Africans who speak French from Morocco and Algeria and stuff, that move to France and that are treated like absolute trash because of racism there. Similar things in like Quebec in Canada. It isn't uniquely France or Quebecois, these kinds of racisms. You find it all throughout the U.S. and Canada. I mean, One of the ways that this manifests too, and we're going to kind of talk about this, is the way that many of you might not know, is the way that in Canada, what English-speaking Canadians love to do is distract from their own racism, their own histories of colonialism by pointing at Quebec and being like, oh, Quebec is the really messed up one. We're fine. We're good. Quebec is the racist one, which is like one of the pernicious ways that English gets a pass in all of this. So don't worry, we're going to return to English, but like English often manages to fly under the radar. And this is afforded to it by the fact that it is so ubiquitous, it is so common, and it is so hegemonically present and totalizing. Now, to return to China again for a moment, I mean, China has been, it's often treated as the boogeyman for difficulties that the French and other European interests are encountering within Africa, because they're like, oh, France, so bad. But this fear extends to so many other places as well, where there was such a moral panic about Confucius Institutes that are these like found in colleges and stuff, where pretty much everyone was just terrified of China. And like, you know, excuse me if I'm wrong. I don't think China has been responsible for any deaths in Gaza. I don't think. Over the last year and a half. I don't think so. I don't think that China is funding the occupation of Palestinian territory. But yes, it is China that is the problem. Yes, of course. And so Salomone is very concerned, of course, about China's lack of restriction on like cooperation. You know, it has so many issues with human rights abuses with the Uyghur people in Western China. Granted, yeah, sure. Like, of course. But if we're actually just comparing the two, the human rights abuses, like really leveled by and committed by Europe and the U.S., why do we hold China up to this standard that we don't hold a standard up to ourselves in the quote-unquote West? It's really interesting to see the way that the most fundamental moral principle is totally lost on these people, where it's like, oh, evil, bad China. And again, I don't think China is great. I'm opposed to all nations. But in any case, let us move on to chapter 7. Adieu to French. It's like bye to French. So Africa's current national structure can be pinpointed to the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference. Berlin Conference was a conference that was held where there were many European leaders who got together to decide how they would essentially divide up Africa, where the English got together with the French, with the Spanish, the Portuguese and stuff, and they got together and they're like, well, how are we going to divide up Africa? Just one of the earliest treatments of Africa is just this site of conquest. I know that the legacies of enslavement happened largely before this, but in any case, this really came to a head and would shape the national terrain of Africa, of pretty much every single African nation, would be shaped in the late 19th century. You may have just heard my cat there. Like I make this show entirely alone. Like I don't get any help with everything, but sometimes I get a cat that like pokes at my ankles when I do this, and it's a good help. It's like my editor. Hazel, yeah, it's a good cat editor. So many nations in Africa now, at least their current structures, reflect these decisions made in the late 19th century by Europeans that they didn't consult any African leaders for about any. It's just the most ridiculous thing. Like the late 19th century, that wasn't that long ago. It's pretty wild. I don't know how Europe is not just like forced to give all of its money in reparations to African nations. Like the reparations that Germany had to give to Israel, for example. Yeah, okay, some amount of legitimacy to that, at least to the Jewish people. But how come not to African nations? Very interesting. But over the past few decades, some interesting stuff has been going on within African nations that have previously been mostly French. Some of them have been switching to English because many African nations that were colonized by the French now have kind of a shaky relationship with French and are turning to English because English offers more economic opportunities because of capitalism. And it is like a way by which to oppose this legacy of French colonialism. So one example is like Rwanda, partly due to France's role and the language and the French language's role in the Rwandan genocide. I can't say France's role. I think I could get in trouble for that. I mean, the French language, like French language playing a part in that, and so the people in Rwanda have a kind of bad relationship with French. So Rwanda, I mean, this is one of the most horrendous events in human history. Really, I can't put it into words how horrible this is, and many of you, I'm sure, know about it. But for those of you that don't know, I'll give a little bit of the history here, and I can't capture all the nuance and the difficulties and all the kind of respect and care that this needs, because it's so horrendous. Like, it's so horrendous. But for decades before the Rwandan genocide in the early 1990s, Hutus and Tutsis, which were the two largest groups within Rwanda, their distinction was largely cultivated by the Europeans that separated Tutsis and Hutus based off of their facial features, where Europeans, I think it was Belgian people, viewed Tutsis as having a closer resemblance to Europeans and therefore getting their own kind of designation, and Hutus not sharing these same qualities. None of this stuff is grounded in reality, but this is one of the ways in which scientific racism worked to separate people, to justify the creation of different national boundaries, to create classes of people that could be easily exploited because it was justified that they were inferior on the basis of their physical qualities, etc., etc. Now, Hutus and Tutsis before the Rwandan genocide, they were in conflict. Tutsis held most of the political power, but they were the minority. They weren't quite as many people. Most of the political power, sort of. Now, the divide between the two emerged when these Europeans, like Belgian colonizers, separated them on the basis of facial features. Now, the Rwandan genocide kicked off when a plane holding the Rwandan Hutu president and the president of Burundi was shot down, and so they died. It's not clear, still to this day, I don't believe, who was responsible for shooting down this plane. But this would kick off Hutu aggression against the Tutsis, which would kill upwards of 1 million people, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of people that would be sexually assaulted. It was like so unbelievably horrendous. Now, Rwanda was and still is a site of geopolitical struggle. Leading up to the genocide, the French were trying to maintain their linguistic control over the region. Now, since then, because France was still really trying to keep a hold over it, since then, the French blamed the Tutsis. It blamed Kagame, who was leader of the Tutsi army, and it was the Tutsis were blamed for shooting down the Hutu president's plane, and that the Tutsis didn't take responsibility. And so Rwanda now, over the last 20 years, 30 years, I should say, has moved away from France because the Tutsi leaders have been like, France has suggested we were the ones responsible for this. And of course, it raised a lot of problems. And so Rwanda has been steadily moving away from French. Now, during the genocide, of the many casualties was also the Ministry of Education that was completely destroyed. And so Rwanda had to rebuild its education department and ministry, and it began to pivot its pedagogical instruction from French to English for grades 4 to 6, with grades 1 to 3 still being taught in Kinyarwanda, one of the indigenous languages to Rwanda. Now, the adoption of English wasn't just to move away from the French colonial past and the role of the French language within the genocide, but also it was because many of Rwanda's allies, its neighboring allies, spoke English. So it made economic sense for them to adopt English as their primary, not indigenous language. Now, the Ministry of Education, its strategic plan celebrated English for transforming Rwandan people into what they called skilled human capital. Isn't that haunting? Please, I don't want anyone to ever refer to me as skilled human capital. For the love of God, please don't do that. What a way to dehumanize people. Now, this creates hierarchies where rich Anglo-Rwandans can get their kids through school quite easily, and this raises a number of issues. And it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because in a lot of cases, it's just the fact that histories of colonialism have produced these conditions now where people are forced to adopt English just to get a job. And it's difficult to criticize that because it's easy for me, right? I mean, I'm this guy sitting in Canada right now. It's Anglo guy sitting in Canada being like, oh, don't learn English. That's part of a colonial past. But these people, they're put in a situation where it's either they learn English or they get no money and they starve to death. That's the world we've created. And so one of the problems is that there are a lot of people criticizing this, but a lot of the people criticizing it are often from privileged backgrounds and have had the easy opportunity of learning English, and are criticizing people from lower class backgrounds who need to acquire English just to live. So it's like, who am I to say, oh, don't learn English? Like, obviously the issue needs to be treated in a much more systematic way, not just like individuals, stop learning English, stop doing what you need to do to survive. But it's a sign in Rwanda, if people can speak English, that's a sign they're probably of the higher economic echelons of that society, just because that's the way it is. And Rwanda has a pretty good education system. Kagame made sure that one of his things is that children can access education. It was mandatory, it was free, and which is great, obviously. But it also extended this extension of English throughout the country. But that's hardly enough to become proficient. Grades 4 to 6, 3 years. You're not going to become really proficient in a language in 3 years. Maybe you will. Chances are not. So only those kids that can afford like private tutors, can afford other means to acquire the language, can really become fluent, where levels of fluency are actually used to assess people's higher ability. The more fluent you are in English, the more likely you are to get a job. That's only open to people that can afford private tutoring, can afford, to send their kids abroad to learn English and so on. And so it's a class thing. Like, it's entirely a class thing. And then there's the case of Morocco, Northern Africa. So, it's primarily Darija Arabic, and there's many French speakers, many English speakers, other dialects of Arabic speakers, Spanish speakers. I mean, Morocco is it's quite a hodgepodge of different languages, obviously. Now, during the 2011 Arab Spring, it added Tamazight as the official second language because of a large population of Tamazight speakers. And it's indigenous in Northern Africa. Other places, Algeria, people in Algeria speak Tamazight, and it's common. It's quite common. And Morocco made it its official second language because of that large population of speakers. Likewise, with other previous French colonies, Morocco has been somewhat welcoming to English, given it not being their colonial language. So Morocco has been effectively moving away from French and adopting English. And it's like, the thing about it is that we all know the English have been worse colonizers than the French. It's weird to compare it because it's comparing like the utmost evil with the slightly like less utmost evil, but still really bad, It's weird to compare it in that way. But one of the ways that English is able to get a pass is that English has become so much associated with like Hollywood, with American culture, that don't have the same kind of colonial connotations, whereas you don't have that with French, right? Yet. You don't have like another country that is like a French-speaking country that doesn't have the same kind of colonial history in a lot of these places, and so the people haven't been able to decouple French from its colonial past, whereas English has been able to take on a new form. Except if, we're not talking here about like Afghanistan or anything like, the U.S. has its own English language colonial history in those places. Not denying that. But that's just one way to understand why there's this shift towards English, despite English's own colonial past and history. Now, one of Morocco's challenges is preserving Arabic while adopting colonial languages like English to be economically and nationally competitive. And this is something that a lot of countries are trying to balance, is like, On the one hand, they're forced to adopt English in order to be economically competitive within a global capitalist system. So they're doing that, and they're also trying to balance their own history and having a relationship with their own language that most people in those places have a relationship to, have a history with, and they're trying to navigate this, and it's really difficult. And it's a challenge that people in the US and Britain and Canada and other primarily English-speaking places don't have to deal with. You know, their history is also bound up with their future. Whereas you have so many other countries where their history might not have a place in its future, really. It's historical language. In fact, it might actually start to go away. I know I'm being kind of doom and gloomy about it, but it's a real thing. And I think it's horrendous to think about these languages disappearing. Because when languages disappear, worldviews disappear. When worldviews disappear, entire ways of thinking and understanding the earth and people, and it just vanishes. It's horrendous. That puts us here into chapter 8, redress and transformation. Now in 2018, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa affirmed South Africa's commitment to equality and plurality and to judge people on their initiatives and hard work. Now, this is like such a neoliberal thing where it's like, oh, I don't see color, I don't see race, I don't see gender. I just see people's hard work and their fortitude and their initiative and yada, yada, yada. But it's like, are we really going to pretend as though people all have an easy time exercising this hard work and initiative? And if this was really true, this type of nonsense is parroted all throughout the US. It's like, we judge people on their hard work and everything like that. I don't see color. And if that was the case, I mean, the richest people in the US would be like black single mothers working many jobs, raising children. I mean, they're working the hardest, aren't they? Shouldn't they be judged the best? But they are not judged the best. How come? Why aren't they judged the best? And this type of neoliberal stuff, this like, oh, it's just initiative and hard work, it just erases the fact that this system, it measures people's worth as humans by their work ethic. Like, they're measured by the value that they bring somebody else in terms of exploited labor. That's all that is. Now, English's place within South Africa is kind of complicated because South Africa was colonized by the Dutch. There's a whole history of the Boer War that I won't go into a lot of detail here, but it had a very, the Dutch were kind of the Dutch were exploiting it for its natural resources, and then the English didn't like that. The English kicked them out, more or less, with African resistance. But then there was English influence, there was Dutch influence, and this would eventually translate into Afrikaans, kind of its own language. Now, of course, the people were not fond of the Dutch, and there was obviously tension there that the British would capitalize on because the Dutch were colonizing these people, and the British were like, oh, we won't colonize you, wink, wink, but we hate the Dutch too. And then eventually the English would take over. So white Afrikaners would oppress black South Africans. And then the English swooped in as a decolonial alternative. And this is one of the English's like tactics. And this is why histories of decolonialism and decolonial efforts always have to be a little bit wary, because it's great. I mean, decolonizing is fantastic. But decolonial efforts have to be wary of the fact that after the colonizer has been kicked out, to be careful of the way in which capitalists then swoop in. Because in a lot of cases, colonizers actually put restrictions on how capitalists can come in because the colonizers want to maintain their power there. And the capitalists are just waiting. They're just waiting for that moment that there's all the civil unrest, colonizers being kicked out, and suddenly there are these entire populations of people that would make for great cheap labor. So English, the language and the people, they branded themselves as the decolonial alternative to the Dutch. Now in 1948, the Afrikaner National Party won, establishing segregation and apartheid. And then Mandela would win in 94, and eventually they would have their constitution, the South African anti-apartheid, post-apartheid constitution in 96. So as Afrikaans as a kind of Dutch spoken language would be the primary spoken language under apartheid for the rich white Afrikaners would speak that language as a kind of holdover from these legacies of Dutch colonialism, that's this blending of many different languages into Afrikaans. Now, the South African Constitution, when it was eventually established in '96, it enshrined equality and multilingualism for all languages: English, many different Afrikaans, Isi Debele, Sepedi, Isijosa, I can't pronounce these properly, Shivenda, Setswana, Sesotho, isiZulu, Siswati, and Zitsonga. These are 11 of the many different languages spoken in South Africa. But one of the things the Constitution really did was try to enshrine that all of these languages are as valuable as each of the other ones. But how much of this was just playing lip service to this idea that all languages are equal? And how much of it was really like, yeah, sure, we'll recognize these other languages, but we're going to really conduct all political affairs in English and Afrikaans. And, the rest of the people can get translators if they want to access it. Well, we're going to make all public documents available only in our like English and Afrikaans. And then other people, they can get translators to do it. And these are the ways in which to measure whether or not politicians and governments are actually being earnest in their claims. Like, are they following up their claims with real material action? So in South Africa, there's actually almost no funding to translate the 9 less spoken, quote unquote, less spoken languages, but it's really spoken by upwards of 75% of the population. There's little to no funding to translate them into English or Afrikaans. So this was just, it's what Glenn Coulthard, the Dene scholar in Canada, colonial Canada, writes about the politics of recognition, where the politics of recognition refers to the ways in which colonial governments, as a strategy, as a neo-colonial strategy, just quote unquote recognize the people that they've colonized. They don't do anything material. They don't give them actual like autonomy over their own land and resources and governance and all that. They just say, oh, we recognize you. Oh yeah, we'll give you a little bit of funding to do your ancestral stuff. That's fine. Anything meaningful though? No. That's still going to be held by the Canadian state. Even in the case of Canada and French, where the French are also colonizers within the Canadian context, in Canada, French speakers, who are so much more privileged than Indigenous speakers of the many different Indigenous languages in Canada, even French speakers can't access resources in French in most of Canada, even though they're supposed to be able to. And it's like, when even such a privileged group as French speakers in Canada can't get resources, imagine Indigenous communities. Like, it's wild. So like in so many other places, in South Africa, economic success is dependent on someone's ability to learn English. Now, although apartheid ended, many of its institutional ideas really remained. So instruction would continue in English schools, Instruction in English would continue in schools. It would cost exorbitant amounts to actually attend schools. And, this is one of the elements of ending things like apartheid or ending things like enslavement. They need to be followed up with actual ways to level the playing field. Because if you just, for example, end apartheid, but you don't actually provide people the means to be able to access all the institutions that they had historically been excluded from, then those institutions can just put a price tag on themselves and be like, look, we're open to everyone if you can afford it. And who can afford it? Who's going to be able to afford it? It's going to be the people who have access to generational wealth, who didn't experience apartheid, who didn't experience, in the case of the US, histories of enslavement, who have whose families hold property that they could sell and make however much money that they need. Like, these are all things that need to be addressed with ending things like apartheid or enslavement or, for example, Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Like, when that happens, it needs to be followed up with obviously making symbolic amends, but also compensating these people and giving them the means to access institutions in a way that allows them to actually be equal in that land, on that land. Now, when apartheid ended, many people still spoke Afrikaans. And in 2015, 20 years or so after apartheid had ended, students began protesting Afrikaans in higher education and wanted it replaced with English. And it's like, oh, well, the English, it's very convenient that English always manages to be like the hero in some cases like this, which is like, again, who the hell am I to say, to be like, oh, that's another colonial language? Like, this is one of the difficulties here, but it's something we should criticize. Now, the history of the conflict began after apartheid as schools and colleges started to desegregate, apparently. So, for example, the University of the Free State was a white-only school with Afrikaans as the primary language. And in the mid-90s, black South Africans started to enroll because apartheid ended. So it wasn't just a white-only school. And they didn't want to learn Afrikaans. I mean, these were black South Africans who had just experienced some of the worst oppressions from people speaking Afrikaans, and now they're going to enter into the institution that they wanted to enter their whole life, and they're going to be taught in that language. Like, how sick is that? Like, what a sick, twisted game that is, to be like, oh, now you have to learn in the language of your oppressor. And it would be decades. It would be till 2015 when they started to really like protest this. And in 2017, it would come to a head when South African court upheld a policy stating students have a right to learn in their preferred language so long as that language maintained equity and inclusion. And so English took the top spot. White Afrikaans speaking instruction would no longer be the norm. But black people still, like, one of the problems is that there were still black people who spoke Afrikaans because they were forced to. And so this kind of affected them negatively as well, which is one of the challenges of the many challenges here. Now, in these debates, the other 9 languages are totally erased, right? So it's just like this debate between English and Afrikaans. You're not seeing a consideration of isiZulu, for example, as, a possible spoken language at colleges all across the country. But it's like English is just this, and see the thing, like Salomone doesn't see it quite as perniciously as I think that English deserves to be treated here. Salomone is almost like trying to play both sides. It's such like, reminds me of when I worked in the government. It was like, oh, soft power and hawks and doves and all that. I hate that language. It's just so mind numbing. But in any case, like, yeah, I think that there's good data in here. We just got to give it our own spin because I'm extremely biased. I'll be the first to acknowledge I'm an extremely biased person. And that puts us here into Chapter 9, Confronting the Raj, where we look at India. Where in India, English is a sign of status. To speak English and the level of fluency that one speaks English in India will elevate their economic and political status. And in the face of India's own its own caste system, which is obviously very problematic, its own histories of the caste system, English actually, ironically, because the British colonized India, English kind of brands itself as this progressive solution to the divisions of like the caste system. So many Dalit, so the Dalit people are considered their Dalit translates to untouchables, and these are extremely oppressed people within India. They speak English. And historically, Indian leaders have used English to combat British colonialism. But David, I thought you said that English was a sign of status. And it is. But it's also a sign, it's also spoken among some of the most oppressed people within India because of these histories of colonialism. And by virtue of that, many people who are the most downtrodden who speak English is then offered as a kind of anti-oppressive language because it's spoken by so many people who are oppressed. And I think it's ridiculous that I'm talking about India this way when India is like such a huge country it has so many nations within it. I mean, just so many different languages and communities. I think I don't even know why I can even use a word like India and pretend as though there's just this one Indian national identity. Because then you have the Tamils in like southern India, and I think that they speak English. They're pretty opposed to Hindi. Like there's so many different things. There's just so many languages, so many dialects from city to city, town to town. People speak differently. People have different languages. It's tough. It's tough to speak about because I mean the last thing I want to do is homogenize these people. So obviously I want to really emphasize the challenge here and emphasize that it requires a whole lot of nuance to talk about language politics within India. So as far as like the history of language politics goes, as though I can pretend to give you anything close to a proper comprehensive history here, the 1949 constitution within India, it didn't there were so many linguistic challenges up till that point. But Gandhi believed, leading up to this, he believed that all Indians should learn their local language as well as Hindustani, which is something. I think that this was why he was assassinated, partly because he was appealing to the wrong people. But English isn't exactly, it's a sign of status in India, but also there's a lot of tension with English, where in 2014, Modi, he ran on a pro-Hindi and anti-English platform. Hence why the Tamils in southern India and the Dalit people who speak a lot of, many of them speak English, not only English, but they speak English. They think that they're fighting the power because Modi is anti-English, except when he's cozying up to Trump. And then it's one of those cases where it's like, oh, we're fine with foreign interference as long as it's English American inspired capitalism. And then it's all good. But in focusing on Hindi, he is also attacking Arabic and Muslim Indians, which is one of Modi's really negative elements of Modi, is that he's very much against Arabic and Muslim. And there's a whole history of the Pakistan, India separation. It's such a history. It's amazing. It's impossible to talk about in such a short amount of time. Now, the fact that there are so many languages in India makes it really, really difficult for schooling. So government schools often have to send teachers to regions where they don't know the language because it's illegal to have for-profit schools in India. There's still schools open that aren't quote unquote for-profit that can be said to really be for profit. But in any case, one of the challenges is that government-run schools need to send people that speak languages spoken in those regions. And there's so many different areas where people speak so many different languages that people receive subpar educations because they're being taught by someone who isn't fluent in the local language. And so you have many students that aren't able to learn really effectively because the person teaching them isn't fluent in the local language. And it's here as well that English swoops in and is like, hey, y'all, I got the solution for you. How about you all just speak English? It'll be great. You'll get jobs. You'll be able to compete on the global market. You can go to the US if you want. Won't that be great? You can go to many places in Europe. It'll be great. Everyone's speaking English. Come on. And it's like, who's to tell these people that they can't do that? But this is one of the things. This is one of the really pernicious elements of this example of neo-colonialism in terms of linguistic colonialism, where English and English-speaking people earn this privilege and this status because of these histories of colonialism. And yeah, that puts us here into part 3, defining the monolingual mindset, in chapter 10, defining the deficit. Now, this is normally where I would have done a new episode, but I really want to get through this book. Not because I don't think the stuff is interesting. I just wish that the author was a little bit, I wish he took a different approach with this. And next time, for those of you that are listening, you'll know that next time I will be starting Noam Chomsky and Edward Ehrman's Manufacturing Consent. So tune in for that. But yeah, chapter 10, defining the deficit. So there's a lot of linguistic bias in the US, which isn't surprising. But it's kind of ironic because the US doesn't actually have an official language. There's nowhere that says English is the official language of the US. I think states say that, like some states specify that, but there's no official language of the US. And for someone to immigrate, though, they have to pass an English test, which is absurd. Why don't they have to pass the Spanish test? Even though, like, I think like 15 for like between 13 and 15% of the population speaks Spanish, not to mention all the other languages spoken in the US. I know I'm being cheeky. Obviously, English is the most spoken language, but it doesn't have an official language. And it's a real problem, especially for Spanish-speaking people in the US who can access services in Spanish and are just underrepresented politically and economically for many different reasons, from colonialism to racism to anti-Mexican bias, like so many other things that it's horrendous what Hispanic people within the US endure. And it's like, this is one of those moments where Salomone just drives me up the wall, where she's like, but don't worry about it. But don't worry about this, because HBO and Netflix, they offer subtitles in 30 languages. And I'm like, Salomone, I don't measure, me personally, because obviously my opinion is all that matters. I don't measure like multilingual success by HBO or Netflix. Like that I don't care. I don't care. And for me, that's just like, wow, what a way to capitulate to capitalist interest and to the demands of the market in justifying and measuring your view of like linguistic pluralism. And she said that, oh, well, actually the US is really accommodating to other languages because everybody loved Parasite. It's like, you have the Oscars that just systematically ignore 99% of non-English films, but they really liked Parasite. So then it's like, oh, well, yeah, good. Well, we've clearly reckoned with the histories of Anglocentrism in the US. Bravo. It's just like, my note, just so you know, this is how I write my notes. Parasite was a hit. Laugh my ass off. That's what I wrote in my notes. So multilingualism is largely viewed negatively in the US. Like, in a lot of cases, it is. A lot of cases, there's like, to be American means you speak American. You speak English. For a long time, like, to be multilingual, not just in the US, but for a long time, researchers believed that being multilingual was a sign of mental inferiority, which has now changed. Obviously, researchers think the exact opposite, but it's hard not to think of those histories of these researchers thinking this as being inspired by racism, because who were the people that were multilingual? Chances are they were immigrants. Chances are immigrants weren't from European backgrounds. Many of them are refugees from different parts of the world needing to access the US, and so they probably weren't white people. And so it's hard not for me to conclude that many of these early researchers were just like, well, obviously non-white people are inferior, therefore multilingualism must be bad. We're just doing Socratic reasoning here. This is logic. Of course, this is great. We're doing science. And while this view has changed, and there is a scientific acknowledgement of the value of multilingualism, for multilingualism has been proven in so many ways. Like, talk about this, I think, maybe not, but like, yeah, we'll talk about this in a little bit. But multilingualism is great. But foreign language learning in the US has been on the decline over the last 20 years. Fewer and fewer people in the US are learning more languages. Now, there might be more people in the US that arrive in the US already knowing another language, and that's different. But the actual phenomenon of people born in America who speak English learning another language has been declining over the last 20 years. And one of the reasons is that many bilingual programs in the US are super expensive. Like, if you want to go to a French school in the US, good luck. It is so expensive. It's so expensive. Well, it depends where you are. But like, it's super expensive in a lot of cases. And only the most privileged get the choice to become bilingual, where people who are forced to be bilingual are usually met with racism and xenophobia. So you get that there's like this kind of strange phenomenon where if you're somebody who's privileged enough to learn another language, you're exalted and celebrated for being like, oh well, you're cultured, you're a real Renaissance person. But if you're forced to learn another language in any context, it's a sign of you being like inferior, or you being in a situation that isn't good, and therefore it's a negative thing, and yada yada yada. So bilingualism is not in itself something that is celebrated or denigrated. It really contextually will determine whether or not it's something that is celebrated or denigrated. And when students in the U.S. are given the opportunity to learn another language, in the United States, they are 8 times more likely across grade school, across colleges, they are 8 times more likely to learn Latin, a dead language, not spoken by anybody, as their mother tongue. They're more likely, 8 times likelier to learn Latin than Arabic or Hindi, which is like, what? How are our priorities that messed up? But that's the status of like language politics in the U.S., where because they know that they can go almost anywhere in the world and speak English, their experience with multilingualism is almost like just for fun. It's for the lulz. Like, oh yeah, I'll learn Latin. That'll be great. Won't that be fun? We'll just learn Latin. We'll know the roots of many words that no one cares about. That'll be so fun. And then they don't learn other languages. Even though learning other languages, like, wouldn't it be, I wish I could learn Arabic. I could. I mean, why would I say that? Obviously, I can put in the work. It just seems like a lot of work. I would love to try. Someone want to teach me Arabic? So give me lessons. But it paints a picture of the way in which language politics functions differently in different parts of the world. And that puts us here into chapter 11, reframing the narrative. So when the U.S. cares about multilingualism, it often cares about multilingualism for national security purposes. So after 9/11, when there was the whole quote-unquote war on terror, which was just the war to kill Iraqis and people in Afghanistan and so on, really horrendous stuff. Then the U.S. was actually really interested in multilingualism because it realized very quickly that its troops were at a disadvantage in their murder sprees because they didn't know how to speak Arabic and they didn't know the language all that well. So the U.S. started to fund people to actually learn Arabic to go to these parts of the world to conduct their death squads and the other violences that they would commit in so many parts of the Middle East. But it's interesting how in some parts of the world, learning another language they need it to survive. Like in so many places, they need to learn English just to earn enough money to live. While in the US, learning another language is like, this is how we're going to best colonize these other parts of the world. Like, there are other reasons for it too. I mean, and diplomacy is one of the really the big ones, in that it's like offered as a good diplomatic strategy to have people who are bilingual, yada yada yada. But yeah, and now it's becoming more apparent that being bilingual or being multilingual is great for your mind. It has been proven to limit or to put off the effects of Alzheimer's, of other degenerative mental conditions, and other things like that. I mean, and it makes total sense. If you're fluent in another language, you pretty much double your vocabulary. Isn't that wild? Like, isn't that wild? You like, how do we have space for that in our minds? If many of us just speak one language, like I like to think my French is okay. Like, just okay. I'd never call myself bilingual. I think my French is okay. And like, it's a big struggle for me in a lot of cases. A lot of ways I'm just like, I'm just an Anglophone because I'm a noob. But like, I try to think, I'm like, oh, it's so hard to learn another word. I try to improve my vocabulary, learn some more words. But there are just bilingual people who double the number of words they know. Isn't that wild? That's wild. I don't know. It blows my mind. Now, Salomone makes, her point here is questionable. But I think she makes an accurate point in that monolingual people, like people who just speak English, will really be negatively affected by this in the future. Because as other parts of the world learn English and other parts of the world retain their own linguistic histories, like China, India, with all of its languages, many different African nations, and they start to compete with the English, when it comes down to it, there will be a day when English won't be the global language of finance, I don't think. It might be like a Chinese language. And when that day comes, suddenly all those monolingual English speakers are going to be at a disadvantage. And that might very well happen one day. It might not. The way things are going, it really seems like the United States will just take everyone down with it. But yeah, it just might negatively affect them in the future. Not to mention the fact that, like I just said, being multilingual, being bilingual has been proven to be good for people's minds in almost every single way. And yeah, that puts us into chapter 12, a revolution in the making. So many states in the US, they run immersion programs. Like in Louisiana, it offers many French programs because of the history of French in Louisiana and Creole, mix of French and other languages. And so there you can actually access immersion French programs in a lot of parts of the world, of the US. But these initiatives and programs aren't always met very positively. For example, in 2015, Houston started an initiative for Arabic competency, and what happened? People showed up with Israeli and US flags to protest this, because obviously Arabic is, I don't even, the answer, why that's the case, but it's just the most ridiculous thing. But there's really active resistance to learning other languages, especially if that other language is Arabic in the US. Now, California has had a turbulent history with multilingualism, where in the 1980s, they outlawed bilingualism in schools. Now, since that time, advocates have fought for and won the right for students to learn in more languages than English. And California has had its own history because of its own anti-Mexican past, anti-Hispanic past, and it's like a big problem, especially because there's a huge Hispanic community in California. I mean, I lived there for most of the year. I can tell you there's a ton of Hispanic people for those of you who have never been to California. I mean, most of those states, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, obviously, so many Hispanic people, and they experience so many different kinds of racisms and linguistic oppression because of the treatment of Hispanic-speaking people by English-speaking Americans. Now, this might not be surprising, but Utah has a very vibrant bilingual community, or many different bilingual communities. A lot of people in Utah speak a lot of different languages. Why? Well, it has a lot of Mormon people, and Mormon people, in order to be part of the Mormon church, have to, I think for the most part, do missions all across the world, where they have to go and spread. It's just, this is just one of the colonialism, right? Just spreading religion. Wasn't that like one of the elements of early colonialism? And so many people in Utah know a lot of different languages through their experience of spreading, of being missionaries, of spreading their religion to different parts of the world. And it's just interesting to see that that's the case in Utah. So, for example, Brigham Young, which is the largest BYU, largest Mormon college, it prioritizes language skills for Mormon missionaries, where Mormon missionaries or prospective missionaries, if they haven't already done it, can learn languages. And the school funds these things because the school wants these people to be Mormonizing the world, spreading the good word of Joseph Smith, or whatever the guy's name is. Like, is it just cool to be a missionary? Like, is that something that we just like allow? Do you see a lot of like Arabic missionaries in, like, I don't know, Dallas? Do you see a lot of that? Why is this okay? I don't know. That seems like bizarre to me. You just go to places where people might not actually know where you are coming from, or like what your religion is, and you're just spreading the religion. Like, I don't know, that boggles my mind a little bit. But yeah, it puts us here into chapter 13, marketing language. And I read a passage. The mother tongue can either increase or decrease earnings. Knowing other languages, on the other hand, cannot reduce earnings. And it's like, all right, Salomone, all your cards are out on the table. You're just very clear that this is all about money. Now, the only reason to learn another language is how much is it going to earn you? Is it going to get you some more money? And it's like, as though there are no other reasons to learn a language. And the thing is, one of the ways that Salomone really bothers me is the way in which she just treats language. She just abstracts it from culture. When it is impossible to be fluent in a language without actually being fluent in a culture. Because so many languages, like so much of how people talk, is informed by the culture, by different trends, by music, by movies, by TikToks in that language, whatever, like so many different things. And Salomone is just like, yeah, just learn a language. Like, you just learn a language. Like, what? Sure, if you do that, you might learn a very narrow sliver of possible like political speech where people talk like in the academically approved way that isn't actually how people talk, or is not actually representative of the language. Yeah, sure, you might be able to learn that. But it's just plain to see here in that her view is just like, oh, well, it's just about making money. And it's like, this is sold to so many parts of the world, especially where you have many US corporations offshoring many of their tech jobs, especially, or like call center jobs, or there's so many other jobs that fall under this rubric, to different parts of the world, like to India and the Philippines, where they sell the idea that learning English gets people more money. And then they hire up these people to work in call centers and to work in like customer support and all this stuff, where they pay them very little, and they're sold this idea that, oh, well, it's better than you would have made before. You know, at least you're making money now. But of course, that completely abstracts from the history that put people in this position where in order for them to survive and live, they need to work for somebody else, which is actually super new in human history. And so she makes sure to say that across much of Europe, Asia, Africa, every single continent, all across the world, English skill correlates with one's salary. So the better you are in English, the better your salary. And she just offers this as like, yeah, it's like a fact. And it's a fact. But shouldn't it be a fact that's followed up with some criticism? Or maybe like identifying why that's the case and the problems with that? And some people might think like, oh, well, with generative AI and with translation software and all that, soon actually learning another language won't be necessary because we'll just be able to rely on translation, or translation on AI or on translation software. And if anyone's listening to this now and you think that that's the case, like, please remove that idea from your mind. Translation software up till today, I don't know about in the future. Maybe 10 years it's going to be able to adapt it the way that human language adapts. I have no idea. But today, translation software is not adequate to actually do translations. You need an actually trained translator to produce good translations. And that's just because translation software is not able to keep up with idioms. It's not able to keep up with cultural and socio-historical references that are relevant to actually making a language intelligible. Because translation is not just about translating the language. Like I said before, learning a language is learning a culture. Translating is about translating a culture too. And so in that case, there's a lot of interpretation necessary to do it. And there's no easy way to translate stuff. Like, for example, in French, there's two words for knowledge. There's savoir and there's connaissance. And a translation software is not going to be able to know the subtle differences when to use savoir versus connaître or connaissance or something like that, because they're different. They connote very different things, and the nitty-gritty nuances are going to determine what word should be used. And yeah, that puts us into the conclusion. Chapter 14, looking back, moving forward. And she recaps everything, though. But if you thought that she just wants a world of English speakers, she clarifies that there is no reason, in fact, why language is both an expression of self-realization and a source of material profit cannot exist side by side. It's like, well, Salomone, you've clarified. This isn't just about money for you. You said instead that it can be both an expression of self-realization and a source of material profit. So then you're right. You're right. You managed to cover all your bases. It's all good. And she ends by highlighting this call among English scholars for people to become more bilingual. And it's like, who is that really for? Who is that call really for? Because people all across the world are forced to become bilingual. They're forced to adopt English that isn't often their first language in order to survive. And people are often forced to become bilingual just to survive. So I don't know why she's putting that in there unless she's implying that it's just meant for English speakers. Like, oh, it'd be great for you to learn another language. Please learn another language. But why? You have to sell the idea that it's for material profit? What about like cultural competency or respect for other people, or opening oneself up to all the beauty of connecting with other people, what that might afford? Why are not these things being amplified here? Like, why is material profit amplified as this is justification for it? And, some people would be like, well, that's how you get people interested. And I'm like, but isn't that a problem? Isn't that the problem? Yeah, we can acknowledge that and be like, shouldn't we be trying to change that? Not being like, oh, well, nothing we can do. Let's just make it about money. Sorry, I'm bitter. I'm bitter because I've been reading Manufacturing Consent, and I'm going to get really bitter when I start covering that next week. Or, sorry, probably in 2 weeks. Too busy now for once a week, so probably in a couple weeks. But yeah, if you like what I did, like, share, subscribe. I mean, this is a good book. There's so much good information. Rosemary Salomone, the research is done really well, and I think that it's a very, very useful book to understand at least the overall idea and the threat that English poses to global multilingualism. But yeah, if there's anything I got wrong, let me know. If you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe, and tell your friends. Who knows, they might get a kick out of it. And yeah, on that note, take care.